So let's get started with our holiday wreath tutorial. We are going to start with a grapevine or ivy base that is just a little bit larger. This one is around 3 inches in diameter. So it's nice to have a little bit of a bigger base when you're making a full lush classic wreath. And today I'm using a variety of fresh greens and some dried, some nigella pods and some oatgrass. I have pine cones, apples, berried ivy, rose hips, pine. It's just a really nice kind of classic selection of materials for a holiday wreath. And I want this to have a lot of different ingredients and textures, but with kind of just that classic holiday feel, because I know you will have clients that do ask for just a really classic wreath. So that's what we'll be working with today. I have the exact recipe listed in the description below, so you can follow that recipe. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is remove the smaller offshoots off of the main branches so that we have a lot of small ingredients to work with. And you can see I'm doing this here with a pine bough. Okay, and then I am gathering all my different greens into small bunches. And what I'm doing is using kind of the filler greens and the more dense greens at the back of the bunch, and then my shorter dried and decorative pieces at the front of the bunch, because I really want those to show in the wreath. And also the dried materials are a little bit more delicate. Now, one thing I'm doing with the particular method that I'm using today is leaving 2 tails on the end of each bunch, pretty long tails, like, 5 inches on each side. And this will enable me to actually tie the bunches right onto the wreath. And I really, really like this method. It makes sure that everything is quite secure, and but it's still totally compostable, and I'm happy with the way it looks as well. So you can see me here tying the bunch right onto the wreath, and I like to do that when I just have a few bunches done so I can make sure they'll work with the wreath base that I'm working with. When I'm adding the bunches onto the wreath base, I want to make sure that the bunches are placed properly so that the branches aren't coming in too far inward. We always want to make sure that we have a circle going. And then in terms of how many bunches I'm making, I made 9 bunches for this 8-inch wreath base, okay? And usually for my wreath kits, I have a 12-inch wreath base, and I end up making 10 bunches. So we end up using around 100 stems with around 10 stems per bunch. And when I say 100 stems, I mean the small offshoots. And as you saw when I was cutting the pine bough, sometimes I'm even cutting a branch in half or in thirds to really get the most usage out of each ingredient. So after I kind of test out one of the bunches, I will continue making all of my bunches. And I'm trying to keep basically the same formula for each bunch. They will vary just a little bit. If you do vary them quite a bit, let's say that you had red berries in some and blueberries in the other, just try to make sure that it's about half and half. If you want to achieve this classic wreath style, you need to focus on repetition. So each bunch needs to be quite similar, because in order to get that look of the classic wreath where you have the repetition of colors and textures and you have that really circular uniform feel, you need each bunch to kind of be the same. Okay, so now let's add each bunch on. And again, we really want to make sure that each bunch is in the right place. So sometimes you'll see that I will try out a couple bunches before I secure it. I will also sort of adjust the greens. Now, since I used like for the rose hips and some of the dried materials, the stems were quite short. So I just want to make sure that I'm not camouflaging or hiding those ingredients. Now you'll notice that when I am attaching each bunch, I'm wrapping it around a few times, and I always try to do the little knot on the back of the wreath just to make sure that everything is consistent and neat and tidy. When you're placing the bunches on, you're placing the top part of your bouquet over the bottom part of the last bouquet, and you want to cover the stems and the twine. Now, sometimes you'll need to go in and trim those stems again. For each bunch, I'm only leaving them about 1 inch on the bottom. And since most of you are in our career program or you're more advanced, you should know this, but I'll throw it in just in case. You may have noticed that on my bunches, the bottom half of the stems are completely cleaned off, except for the pine, just because it's a little bit sticky and it's a little bit more difficult to do. But we always want to make sure that we're, like we would do for a flower arrangement, we are cleaning off that bottom section of the stems for a few reasons. It makes it a lot easier, for instance, if you're going to weave some of those stems through the base, and it makes it just a lot less bulky. It's neater and tidier. It's one of the basics of natural mechanics. We always want to make sure that our stems are cleaned up on the bottom. Okay, so when you get to the last few bunches, you want to be very careful that you are camouflaging all of the twine and the mechanics. I've seen some people get to this point and then they just kind of like place the bunches at different angles, and that just doesn't give you like a super professional look for your wreath. So you want to make sure that your bunches are still all facing the same direction, okay? And so it's just a little bit more tricky because you need to hold the bunch that's going to be camouflaging the bottom stems of the last bunch. You need to hold those top stems up and just kind of poke the bottom part of your last bouquet underneath those, okay? And you may need to kind of go back and reinforce some areas with twine or trim some stems. And I also, as you'll see, I like to kind of lift the wreath up and even hang it at certain points to make sure that everything is going as I envisioned. And So once the basic wreath is done, it's time to add the other decorations like fruit, pine cones, and ribbons. So let's start with the fruit. If you've taken my other wreath classes, you know I have a few different methods for adding fruit, and this one is my current favorite. So what I do is take a strong ivy vine. You want something that's kind of a medium weight, so it's not too big that it will sort of destroy the fruit, but it needs to be thick enough that you can poke it through the fruit. Now, a couple of very important steps for this. You need to remove all of the leaves from the ivy. Again, in this case, we're using the ivy vine as a mechanic, so it's really important to remove all of those leaves. And then you want to cut it at a diagonal angle because that will enable you to poke it right in the fruit. And you want the part that's going through the apple to be basically halfway through the apple, just so that it feels secure. You should be able to like lift it upside down and have the apple not fall off. Okay, I'm just loving this method. And then what I do is basically then just poke that vine through the wreath base and weave it through. You can also secure it with some twine. It just gives you a lot more flexibility in placing your fruit, and then I think the fruit doesn't look quite so stiff when it's sitting in the wreath. So for adding pine cones without wire, I do a couple of different things. Some of my pine cones were actually still on the branch, which is really nice. So I'll just cut that branch down, poke it right through the wreath base, and then I will tie it with twine and secure it in the back. And if there's any sort of sticking up on the front section of the pine cone, you can leave that if you like it, or you can go ahead and trim it. The other thing I like to do is just wrap twine through the area of the pine cone that will allow me to secure the twine around it, tie it in a knot, and again leave the tails so that then I can just secure it with the twine. Being a classically trained florist, I have, always traditionally been working with wire, except for the last, probably six or so years. And I just think it's always really fun to discover new ways to use twines and vines. And I'm sure you'll discover some of your own methods as well. But I hope that these are helpful to you with your holiday wreath making. They're totally secure and totally compostable. So I think that's exciting. What I'm doing in terms of composition here is kind of sticking to the bottom half section of the wreath for the most part, and placing the apples kind of in a triangle, which is a really nice visually compelling composition. And then I've just done 2 pine cones and I've placed those diagonally across each other, okay? So I like the way that looks. In the past, I've also done something where I've kind of grouped 3 small fruits together at the bottom of the wreath. And at this point, you can play a little bit. And I always think it's really helpful to hang the wreath up too, or to look at it straight overhead to see if you're liking the composition. To add the ribbon, I simply choose a corner of the wreath. I like to do kind of the bottom left or bottom right section of the wreath, and then choose a secure stem to simply tie the ribbon on, and then of course I cut the tails. And a lot of times I will hang it in a temporary position while I'm doing this if I'm getting it ready for a client or something like that. I like really casual ribbons. Gone are the days of these like wire ribbons where we would then take other wire and wire them onto the wreaths. I think it's really nice to have it just super simple and natural. This is 100% cotton ribbon. This is the same ribbon we use in our kits for all of our private workshops. And I love it because, yes, again, the ribbon is compostable. And I think it's just a really sweet, festive touch, and it feels like it's not trying too hard. If you want to make this wreath a little bit more wild or more full, you can, before you add the ribbon, go in and add more branches, taller pieces of greenery, and weave them through the base. But I hope you've enjoyed this classic wreath workshop. Please post your wreath, photo of your wreath in the comments so I can send you some feedback. And have a wonderful time hanging your wreath. Let me know where you hang it. I will see you on December 18th for our holiday centerpiece workshop. Thanks for attending our workshop today. See you soon.